Today on The Communicative Leader, we welcome Adam Boddison, CEO of the Association for Project Management. Adam discusses large-scale organizational growth and the strategies and tactics that can be used to achieve it. So we talk about this, we talk about scalability, how to replicate, how to sustain, but also Adam just gives us some really, really great concrete leadership and communication takeaways. So let's dive in. Hello and welcome to The Communicative Leader, hosted by me, Dr. Leah O'Million-Hodges. My friends call me Dr. O. I'm a professor of communication and a leadership communication expert. On The Communicative Leader, we're working to make your work life what you want it to be. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to learn more about large-scale organizational growth.
Of course, thank you for having me on the podcast. So my name's Adam Boddison. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Association for Project Management. So that is that is a professional body. We've got 45,000 individual members. We work with 500 corporates, and we're a registered charity. We exist for the public benefit. It's also always about improving society by delivering projects better. I've been there for about 3 years. I kind of got into this job by accident, really, because my last chief exec role was for a national inclusion charity, which was interested in children with special needs and disabilities. And that also wasn't my background. My background is actually as a maths teacher, a school maths teacher, in fact. But in my last role, because I became if you like, put in the specialist box of you're an expert about children with disabilities, I thought that's great, but I want to do much more than that. So I deliberately looked for something broad, hence found this project management role, and boy, is it broad. I mean, this is every sector you can imagine. Yes, education, but it's also defense and nuclear and energy and healthcare. And wow, it's just absolutely brilliant. Really, really love it.
Excellent. And I love that when you can take these skills and then move into a different industry and then parlay those new experiences, I just think it really, it speaks to someone who loves learning and is good with people and good at navigating organizations. So I imagine that you really do well and enjoy this role that is so expansive. Yeah. So kudos to you.
No, thank you. Interestingly, I remember going for my interview for my first CEO role, which was in this special needs charity. And one of the opening questions was, Adam, you don't know a lot about special educational needs. What makes you think you're going to have any credibility at all in this role? And I remember my answer to that was, well, my first kind of vote of confidence is the fact that you've shortlisted me for this post. Why did you shortlist me for the post? And then we had this, you have to imagine the scene. This was like a big long table. We had like most of the board of trustees on one side and me on the other side. It was like facing the Last Supper, or something like this. And ultimately, what was really interesting, what they decided was, look, we've got an organisation that's rammed with people with special needs expertise. What we need is a leader. We need someone who can help scale our organisation, help us to grow, help us to really sort out the commercial side. And that's what I was able to bring. And of course, you learn the rest on the way.
Yeah, that is phenomenal. I love that as a leadership scholar. That is really neat, taking that perspective. So we know we're going to be looking at large-scale growth. And a question for you is, can you help define that for us? And what are the criteria that go from just, a general organizational change or shift or even traditional organizational growth to large-scale growth?
Yeah, so really good question. And I actually think, I thought a lot about this. I don't think you can put a particular metric on this and say, well, if it's below that threshold, it's not major, and it's not large scale, and if it's above it, then it is. I think it's really contextual. And it's dependent on both the organisation and the operating environment. If I give you an example, the inclusion charity I talked about before, that was a professional membership association. They'd been around for about 40 years at the time. They'd never really had more than about 3,000 or 4,000 members. But actually, the pool, if you like, the market of possible members was hundreds of thousands. They've grown. If you looked at, they've grown from 0 to 4,000 over 40 years. You could say, okay, is that, does that count? But when I was there in 6 years, we went from 4,000 to 40,000. And then
wow.
in the 3 years that followed,
Yeah.
my successor took it from 40,000 to 100,000. So something changed. And it's, to me, it's about orders of magnitude. So when you say, how do you define it? I don't think it's a particular metric. It's how does it, it's relative. It's how does it compare to the past, but how does it compare to other organizations like us? And by the way, it could be on a whole range of things. So I talk about number of members there because that was their main metric. It could be revenue, surplus. I even think engagement is a really important one as well. You know, when you take an organization that's kind of, you know, let's say known for quality but not known enough, and then all of a sudden they just hit the mainstream, that in itself for me would constitute large scale growth.
Yeah, excellent. That's really helpful. So it's kind of this process, and like you said, contextual. It's not this destination, like we've arrived, we've done that, you know, all set, boxes checked.
Exactly
Excellent.
that.
So I'm wondering now about some key strategies. So what, you know, maybe in your previous work or in the work that you're doing now, what do you see these strategies or tactics that tend to be most effective, or that if we're going to, you know, advise organizations who are looking to make this shift, you know, what do we encourage them to do?
Yeah, again, a great question. I think obviously some of this is about painting the picture, the vision and so on, but I think that alone is not enough. But if I give you an example of in my current organization at the moment, I talked before about, you know, corporate partnerships that we have and memberships and so on. So we really need to scale our organization. And the reason we need to scale is not just for growth's sake. It's because we are a relatively immature professional body. You know, we've been around for just over 50 years, 52 years, in fact. But there are other organizations, the accountants, the engineers, you know, they've been around for hundreds of years, you know.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about them, even though they've been around for hundreds of years, they all tend to have a scale which is around about the same size. So that's obviously the scale you need to have to have a tangible impact. So what I did in terms of your question about what specific strategies or tactics can you use, what I did was rather than just say, right, well, we need to be that big, guys, I said, what would it take? What would it take for us to get there? So in my particular context, we have what I call the 1-10-100 strategy. So I said, what would it take for us to become an organization that has 1,000 corporate partners, 10,000 chartered project professionals, and 100,000 members? And what that does, when you ask the question, rather than saying this is the destination, when you ask the question, it focuses on the how, not on the what. So people start saying, oh, Adam, you know, that's, if you really want to do that, we're going to need to double our workforce. Or, do you know what, Adam, if we're going to do that, we need to have some kind of technology revolution because we don't have scalable processes here. Everything's done by hand and there's 150 touch points for every single person we bring on board or something. So it shifts the focus to really look at the scalability. And I have 3 tests that I always ask for in my organization. If we're going to do something, it has to be replicable, scalable, and sustainable. And if it doesn't meet those 3 tests, we shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, I love that. It's so helpful because I think you're right. When you're asking the right questions, the how, we're changing the way we think. All of a sudden, it becomes concrete. It's something that we can actually solve and make a process to achieving.
I agree. And
rather
interesting,
than just,
yeah, no, it's interesting when we start to have those conversations, what tends to come out are the pain points and the gain points, right? Because people in every organization, you've got people who say, oh, this bit of the organization doesn't work because, and you need to try and shift that narrative. So instead of hearing, you know, we can't do this because, we can do this if. And that's what the what does it take question does, is it shifts from one mindset to the other mindset.
Yes. Yep. And I, like, as an organizational scholar, I'm so happy hearing about employee empowerment, that idea of giving them in a room to be innovative and to think about it. That's really incredible. I imagine you have really good retention because people feel engaged and heard.
Interestingly, so we have an external organisation that we use to kind of get staff views and so on. And you know, we've been doing that. It started before I arrived, but over time, over the past kind of 5-6 years, the feedback that we get from that goes up and up and up, exactly for the reason you said around staff engagement. I think the challenge we have is not so much with engagement, it's trying to match appetite with capacity. So you empower all of these staff and they go, great, we can do all this stuff, and the leadership team, I'm the worst offender, right? I'm like, we can do this, let's go. And then you look around and you say, we can't really do all of this stuff. And so then you've got to be careful that you don't go too far and create these kind of workload challenges. So we've kind of gone from one problem we've solved. It's a bit like whack-a-mole, and another problem pops up somewhere else.
Pops up. Oh, that's excellent. So this is a really nice segue. So I was wondering about resources. So thinking about prioritizing them, allocating them. So if we know that we are kind of growth focused, and it's probably hard to find an organization that says they are not growth focused in some way, but what is that? What does that advice look like when they're saying, Adam, I don't know what to do with these resources. How do I best allocate these?
Yeah. Again, I don't think there's any silver bullet for this. There's no one way of doing it. Otherwise, every organisation would be doing it already, right? So I think I start with that caveat. But if I try and think, what has generally worked for me in organisations, there's a couple of things. So I think the first one is, where are the efficiencies in business as usual? So mapping out all of those business as usual processes that, we can't live as an organisation without, and saying, is there a way we could do this better and therefore free up resource that we can allocate elsewhere? That does two things. One, it makes people's lives easier, so they're happier and therefore more productive. But two, it just gives you more resource for free. So why wouldn't you do that? So secure efficiencies in business as usual. Then what I always tend to do is over-resource deliberately those areas which bring growth into the organisation. So what do I mean by that? I mean things like marketing, business development, external engagement, so speaking at events and all that profile stuff, roundtables, all of those things. Because although sometimes some of those things have very tangible returns on investment. Some of them are slow burns, but actually they always pay off in the end, in my opinion, if you're doing them well. So get the efficiencies, over-invest in or over-resource in growth. And then the third thing for me is around workload. I mentioned it before. When you really get people fired up, they want to do a brilliant job. And we have an interesting situation in my organisation at the moment where we have really diligent colleagues who produce such excellent work that it's almost too good. And you have this situation where they've got a lot of things to do, but the standard is so high that you say, look, this is not scalable because it's too good. So we have, we've been talking about, are we letting perfect be the enemy of good? Here, is good enough okay? Sometimes you need perfect, right? But sometimes, so there's this kind of self-imposed workload that sometimes comes in. So we're having open conversations about that, and we also put in a stop and slow initiative, which says to people, what are the things that you do in your job, which if you stop doing them or spent less time on them, actually it wouldn't really impact on our ability to meet our strategic goals. And actually, when people start looking at that, it turns out there's quite a bit in that bucket that they can release workload and resource from.
That's incredible. I really love what you're doing. And I think, anytime a communication scholar hears open dialogue, right? It's heart to eyes, because there's so many times, especially employees, and I'm finding this a lot post-COVID, especially, where resources still aren't necessarily where they were. Flexibility, lifestyle isn't exactly where it was, and some people are so afraid to speak up. But when organizations create these opportunities, and I like that stop and slow initiative, where you have to stop, you have to reflect, this is just part of our work, that really, really pays off in so many different areas.
Yeah, I mean, lots of organisations have, I think they call it stop, start, continue, which is again a more traditional version of this. I quite like stop and slow because we're saying we don't want to introduce anything new here, right?
Exactly.
Just focus on those things that are going to help you, stop or slow.
Yep, exactly. Yep, nice and simple and clear. So that brings us to message clarity. And I'm wondering, what are things either you've done or you kind of see some of your corporate partners do? Because you know that organizations can be really large, they can be broken up, a lot of hierarchy. So how do you ensure this message is consistently communicated across an organization, especially when we're having those rapid periods of growth?
So first of all, we know from it's in the academic literature, it's in like every leadership book you ever read, every communications book you ever read. You've got to tell people a lot of times before the message sinks in, whatever the message is.
Yes.
And probably in a lot of different ways as well, because people hear the messages in different ways. So I think repetition is important because we've just had the general election over here, right, in the UK, and one of the interesting things is the Prime Minister Keir Starmer, when he was elected, there were lots of kind of satire, kind of jokes about the fact that everywhere he went, he kept saying to everybody, "Oh, did you know that my father's a toolmaker?" And it kind of became the joke, right? And when they talked to the strategists about this, they said, "Why does he keep going on about this?" And they said, because actually he needs to repeat it that many times so that people. So there is real logic in this. So I think repetition's important. The other thing I learned, and this is maybe personal to me, because with my background as a maths teacher, I like to be logical and have logic models for how things are going to work, but that's not enough. Just because something looks good on a piece of paper and there's a real logic to it, it's not going to work for everybody. I really believe in storytelling as a leadership technique. So this is kind of almost drawing on the literature skills. How do you tell a really effective story that who all the characters are, what their roles are going to be, where the tension and the drama is going to be, where things are going to go disastrously wrong, but actually it all works out well in the end and we have this happy ending. That actually is really applicable to a business context and captures the heart as well as the head of people. So I think that's absolutely essential if you're going to get this kind of organizational clarity. And by the way, all of this is much harder in this new world of hybrid. Like when people are there every day and you can have all of that conversations and all those, the water cooler conversations, how do you replicate that in hybrid? Well, we're still working on that, but it's definitely harder now than it was before.
It makes me think of, we had Karen Eber on, so she is all about storytelling, and she was talking about the neuroscience behind it, and actually more real estate in our brain lights up when we're listening to stories. And that also leads to not only retention, but also feelings of psychological safety. So it actually puts your employees in a calmer, more comfortable place. So I can see why you really like that.
Yeah. Interestingly, I'm sure lots of your listeners of this podcast have been experimenting with AI and things like that. One of the things I do when I have an idea that I want to communicate or I want to get some organizational clarity, I have a chat with AI. It's quite interesting. So probably a couple of times a week, I just have a bit of back and forth, and I say, do you know what, ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever your preferred AI provider is. So I've been thinking about this. What do you think? Is this the best way to say it? And it comes back and it says, well, have you thought about it? And sometimes my way's better, right? I mean, without meaning to sound egotistical about it. But more often than not, the AI is better. And actually, that kind of back and forth can really help you to polish how you're going to communicate that idea across without, if you like, burning through real people, but, with the idea. Before it hits a human, you've already had that kind of back and forth.
Yeah. And if we're thinking about their workloads, it's kind of, ability to lessen their load or maintain it. Well, you can have that sounding board that's so helpful.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about messaging and communication, and now I'm wondering about leadership styles. So I a leadership scholar. I know there's so many different paths to being effective. And I'm wondering if you have found or observed some particular traits or styles that tend to be really effective when we're looking at this kind of large scale change.
Well, it's a bit like the conversation we had before around, strategies. Again, there's no one leadership style that I think works for everyone in every situation, or everybody would be doing it. So I think there's one ability that leaders definitely need to have, and that's the ability to switch between different styles. And that's not just contextual. I think it's also about managing one's self, because sometimes you can get better out of yourself and your own ability by using a particular style with a particular person. So I think that's part of it. I also have discovered that the more senior you get in your role, the more you need to be less worried about your own style and more worried about how you get the best out of other people. And so in a sense, your own style is, I'm not saying it's not important, but it's more important that it generates the right style in that whole leadership team around you. I wouldn't quite go as far as this, but it's almost like if it came to sacrificing yourself so your whole leadership team could perform better, because everybody thought you were an idiot in terms of how you were running it, but all the teams were working brilliantly, that would be worth it in my book. So it's probably quite an unusual perspective on things. I find coaching culture is a really, really good. So this is something we've been working on in our organisation, is trying to create this kind of coaching culture. And we started with leadership teams, so with individual executive coaches, but group coaching as well. And now we're kind of cascading that through the organisation. And that creates an emphasis on feedback, honest conversations. So that's great. And I suppose the last thing I would say is alignment to values. For me, I think is really important, because people can tell, right? They can tell if you say the values are this and then you're saying or doing something else. They know it doesn't fit. We have one in our organisation which I've never seen anywhere before. So we have four values. We talk about being excellent, progressive, thoughtful, and then we have this other one, which is that we are a warm organisation.
Oh, yeah, I haven't heard that one.
And
but I love it.
I've heard the others before. When I arrived, I thought, what is this warm thing? I mean, normally warm, we're talking about global warming. That's bad, right? So I'm like, what's does this mean we're like, I don't know, we're all sitting around on bean bags? What's it all about? And it turns out this warm thing is about saying, look, sometimes we've got to make hard decisions. Sometimes we've got to make unpopular decisions. Sometimes we've got to do things that not everybody agrees on. But that doesn't mean we can't do it in the right way. Treat people decently, with respect. Bring people along with us. Really try hard to communicate what we care about and why we care about it. And I tell you, boy, do we live this value. If this is not a value that's in the drawer that we never, no one knows about. We live it. And it's so powerful. And so this kind of leadership styles that link directly with those kind of values, I just think are incredible.
Yeah. And I like the reminder, because I think we're at a point in society where there's so much divisiveness and so much strife and so much uncertainty that having warm as a consistent part of your work life and infused in those relationships and decisions, that's a place I want to work at.
Yeah, no, I agree. And some people, have criticised this before, externally, and said, look, does warm mean like you're a bit, you're not as ruthless as you need to be, or you're not as sharp-edged? And actually, it doesn't, because it's not about what we do, it's about how we do it. And I think that's the difference.
Yeah, I like that distinction. So we just talked about these effective approaches to leading in organizations, and more specifically in organizations looking for large-scale change. So now I'd like to ask you about instances that you've seen that are less effective or maybe downright counterproductive. So what are some of those, what is that bumpiest path that you've seen people take or tried to take in this route?
Yeah, again, an excellent question. I suppose the obvious place to start is when you get the opposite of what I've just talked about, a misalignment to the values, where the behaviours doesn't match the rhetoric, if you like. And I think that's highly problematic. People see through it pretty quickly and things unravel pretty quickly. So it doesn't really matter whether you're trying to achieve large-scale growth or just keep the show on the road. It's going to fall apart pretty quickly. So I think that's problematic. The other thing is, I think when there's an undervaluing of difference, and I'm thinking particularly of things like, neurodiversity and so on. We see it sometimes with kind of introverts, extroverts, whichever, side of the equation you fall on, the idea that your way is the only way to do it. and therefore you don't value anybody that does it a different way, or it's not quite as good as your way. I think that is really problematic, and I've seen leaders fall foul of that several times. I think organisationally, lack of room for progression can be problematic, because then your good people kind of have nowhere to go, and so they either get demoralised or they leave. You know, so and there are so many options. You don't always have to promote people or pay them more. You know, you can give them other. You know, I think secondments are great. You know, because then you get people back at the right time. You know, with all this other skills to bring. I think giving people opportunities to kind of shadow and step into other roles for periods of time. So I think there's lots of things you can do there.
Yeah.
But I think the two biggest problems that I see are leaders where they either don't own their mistakes, because then it creates a kind of blame culture. You know, it's not my mistake, it's your mistake, or they don't take enough risk. So that risk appetite piece, in terms of if you and it's particularly true of growing organisations, right? If you're going to change the dial and do something different, if you want to grow at a different pace, you've got to do something different. So not taking enough risk, I think, is a big problem.
That makes sense. And like I'm feeling anxious because I'm thinking about all of these things, and I know it happens in organizations, but that is a tough organization to be part of. So now, when I was getting ready for our chat, I was thinking about, short term and long term. In this vision, because growth, as you said, vision is one part of it, but we can't get there alone with vision. But, what do you recommend in thinking about talking to employees and stakeholders today and kind of keeping them in conversation as we head towards this long-term goal?
Yeah. So, I mean, some of it is about measuring and tracking and reporting, so people know where they are on the journey. Are we getting any closer? Are we in the same place as we were last year? What's working? What's not working? And some of that is not just about presenting the positive picture of, look, we're doing great on this stuff, but don't look over there. That's not working. Yeah. Actually, shine a light on the bad stuff as well, because that's where you get the ideas from people that say, actually, we could do something differently here, or maybe we just abandon that because that's just not going to work for us, and put our resources into something else instead. So there's that honesty in terms of regular communication about what's working, what's not working. Are we getting towards it? I've seen some offices where they have these kind of big kind of thermometer type charts on the wall or something like this, so it's really visual and stuff. I love that. Others where they have the homepage when people log in is like a dashboard from the CRM or something, which shows them where we are. So that kind of thing is great. But the other thing is, you've got to have a few aces up your sleeve for the long term. Do you know the film School of Rock with Jack Black?
Yes.
Yeah. I love this film. But if anyone's not watched this film, right, you're missing a treat. You've got to watch this film. But he has a line he uses in this film where he says, "One great rock show can change the world." And I think let's think about that in a business context, right? Yeah. What are the rock shows that you've got kind of coming up your sleeve? So not the main strategy stuff and the business as usual and the short term and long term goals, but a few kind of game changers, most of which probably won't go anywhere, but you only need one to come off, and it's going to massively accelerate your progress and change the world, to use Jack Black's phrase. So I think as a leader, you've got to kind of set a few of those hairs off at some point and see what happens.
Yeah. Yes, I absolutely love that. And I love the inspiration, because I always say leadership inspiration is everywhere, and we connect with it all differently. But when you make that connection, then figuring out how do I parlay this into what I'm doing and where I want to be.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah. So, Adam, I have two final questions for you, and these are kind of interconnected. So on the communicative leader, we like to leave our listeners with pragmatic leadership or communication. It can be a tip, advice, challenge. So first part of the question, what advice do you have for our titled leaders out there, right? Our managers, directors, it could be CEOs, anyone who has that formal leadership position.
Sure. Well, I've got two pieces of advice, if I'm allowed to. So I think the first one would be to judge people more by their intentions than by their actions, because then you encourage that risk taking I talked about before. They're not going to be shot down because actually they had a good idea, but it was badly implemented or it didn't quite come off in the way they expected. As long as they've got the right intention, you can help someone to get there. If someone hasn't got the right intentions, I mean, it's a non-starter. It doesn't matter if they accidentally get it right, So I think that intentions piece is really important. So that's the first one. The second one for me is around picking your battles. As a leader, you come across all kinds of things that you could, get your sticky fingers all over and try and sort out. But in my mind, those battles have to be small enough to win, but big enough to make a difference. And if they don't fall into that sweet spot, then you should leave them well alone, because it's either going to give you a fight that just creates chaos and disharmony, or it doesn't kind of matter anyway. So, that would be my two pieces of advice.
Yes, I love that. I'm always reminded how much leadership is like parenting for parents out there. When you're talking about message repetition, how all the leadership books say, I'm like, so do parenting books. And this too, figuring out how, does it make sense to pick here? And then I think too is the immediacy. Like, is this going to cause a huge immediate issue? Or is this just something that's a one-off, right? Like, so like you're saying, like, is this not going to make a big difference, even if I could win it? Gonna let it go.
Yeah, absolutely. And letting it go, is harder than it sounds sometimes. As a leader, you're in a room and you can see something's not quite right, and you feel like almost a professional obligation to say something, and being able to kind of bite your tongue and say, do you know what? I'm just going to leave. I'm just going to leave it because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that much. Yes, that's honestly so much harder than it sounds.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep. And it makes me think about your point when you're talking about how when you get to these higher ranks as a leader, part of your skill and what you're bringing to the table is to help others to shine and to, raise up their leadership. So part of that might be modeling the grace and kind of letting some of these things like, okay, this doesn't have an immediate consequence. Gonna let it go. And I think that's really a beautiful example of leadership.
I mean, I'll tell you a real example. It happened earlier this year. So I was meeting a CEO of another organisation. I won't say who, but it was overseas. Anyway, let's put it that way. So over in the Middle East, and I was meeting this person for the first time. I had three members of my team with me, kind of middle management type staff. And this person, it was just one person from their side. It was this chief exec, first time meeting in person. And we sat down, and this guy's opening comment was, "Adam, you remind me a lot of Louis Litt from Suits. You look so much like him. I can't believe it." And now I've seen that program, right? This character is not known for good reasons, right? Yes. If anyone's seen, if your listeners have seen this, they'll know it's a bit kind of nerdy and so on. Now, it would have been so easy for me to be really offended, really insulted by this, to comment that was not an appropriate way to start a meeting or whatever. And in fact, it took all my will to say, "Oh, I must watch that program sometime and find out exactly who you're talking about," and then move on. And actually, a couple of members of my team said afterwards, "We know you've watched that program," and I said, "Well, yes, but." That's not a great way to start a relationship off if I pick fault in the very first thing they've said to me. So that's just a real example, of something that's happened this year.
Yeah, that is excellent. Your professional probably is like, what is going on? And then taking the time to think that through. Yeah, kudos to you. So that final part of the question. So we've talked about some advice for our titled leaders. What about for all employees, any rank, any industry? What do we leave them with?
I suppose I would want to remind people that their words matter. What they say and what they do really matters. And actually, people at any level have more influence than they know on the people around them. There's a story from when I was a maths teacher, which always kind of comes to mind when I think about influence. So I remember my very first year as a kind of, I just finished as a student teacher, my first year as a secondary school maths teacher, so high school maths. And And I came into this lesson one day to the classroom, and there's a young man there with his feet on the table, hands behind his head, didn't particularly want to be there, I think. And I said to him, come on, get your feet off the table. I said, you wouldn't do this at home, would you? And he said to me, no, but then I wouldn't do algebra at home either. And I said, well, that's actually a really funny answer. So I gave him 10 kind of house points, just like this reward system they had. The guy nearly fell off his chair. He was 15 years old. He said in his 15 years, nobody had ever given him house points before. He'd never been given a reward before. I mean, he was a bit of a rogue, this chap, right? You have to understand. Anyway, we ended up getting off on the right foot, and we got on quite well. He went on to do his his GCSE exams. So they're the exams they do at age 16 in the UK. I'd left the school by then, but many years later, I saw him on a train. I was on a train going somewhere, and he spotted me, and he said, "Oh, do you remember?" And we talked about this time and falling off the chair, all of this. And he said to me, I said, "Well, what do you do now?" He said, "I'm a maths teacher." And by the way, I do algebra at home every day. But the point was,
I got goosebumps. Yeah.
What he said to me was, "Look, no other teacher cared, about me." He said, I went on, I got my GCSE, I went on to do maths at A-level university, became a teacher. He's now a head of maths in a high school. And he puts it down to this one conversation. It wasn't all of the stuff afterwards, the exams, all of that was enablers. But the thing that really mattered was that one conversation. And I was fortunate that I happened to bump into him, and we had this conversation. I would never have known. But the reason, sorry, I'm going a bit round the houses here, Leah, but what I'm saying is in the workplace. In a workplace, people are having these conversations all the time. It could be, over lunch, round the water cooler, on a Teams meeting. But those words matter, and they could be life-changing for people. So I suppose my advice is think carefully about what you say, because it could change someone's life.
Yeah. Gosh, I absolutely love that story. One I will not forget. It's so cool that you got to see that go full circle.
Yeah, I was very lucky, very lucky.
Yeah. Adam, it has been an absolute joy chatting with you and learning from you. And I'm so excited to share all your words of wisdom with our listeners. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
All right, my friends, that wraps up our conversation today. Until next time, communicate with intention and lead with purpose. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon on The Communicative Leader.